Awesome. So we'll be discussing the past, present, and future of freeways. Like Kayla mentioned, this topic is really inspired from some research, um, given to us and inspired by Gould Evan's Central Freeway design project. And we're oh my gosh, we're fortunate enough to have two members of the project team here to later discuss the project. So I'm Olivia. I'm currently a third year studying city and regional planning down at Cal Poly, and I'm zooming in from San Francisco.
And I'm Adam, a recent college graduate. So we can all agree that there's a severe housing shortage in the Bay Area, making the area prohibitively expensive. Displacement is rampant in poor neighborhoods, with people of color disproportionately impacted. And freeways have been a major contributor to both this housing shortage and our environmental crisis. So we'll start with an overview of the history of freeways. It's easy to forget, especially in 2021, that freeways haven't always existed in American cities. So how and why did freeways become such an integral part of them? Then we'll talk about what the impact is on our housing, how freeways contribute to our shortage, weakened transit infrastructure, and how they were used as a tool to enforce segregation. And on the upside, the future is bright. So cities are realizing these negative impacts, and we'll show you what they're doing about it. But let's look at the numbers quickly. Today, over 90% of Americans have access to a car. There are 50,000 miles of US interstate highways, and that includes 19,000 miles in urban areas. In the Bay Area itself, on Interstate 80, pre-COVID numbers had almost 300,000 cars going on Interstate 80. And unfortunately, they continue to reinforce racial and economic segregation. So these statistics, really speak for themselves. Freeways are a cornerstone of American transportation infrastructure, and they're also a physical remnant of blatantly racist and generally misguided housing policy in our cities.
So how did freeways come to be? Freeways really began to pop up after the passing of the Federal Highway Act of 1956. This was the second rendition of the act, the original passing in 1944. And these really contributed and coincided with the automobile production and culture, which were highly on the rise. So we're looking at post-World War II, Americans were having high purchasing power. They were wanting to travel further distances, experiences new parts of the country. And as a result of that, automobile production was increasing really rapidly. So because now we had this growing car infrastructure and we had, rise of production, we were seeing a lot of white flight, where those who were white were fleeing the cities to the suburbs, which are advertised as these kind of all-inclusive, very community designed areas. And when the white flight occurred, it often left those of color and those of lower income in cities, which were, lacking funding and becoming decayed. So, like I mentioned, the Federal Highway Act of 1956 really kickstarted the construction of freeways. The act was part of the national system of interstate and defense highways. It was really designed to increase prosperity and opportunity in the country, connect people to new parts of it, provide the opportunity to live further than where you worked. So like I mentioned, there was originally the 1944 Act, and this covered about 50% of all highway construction. The 1956 Act really increased this, and it was covering up to 95% of construction costs. So just over the course of these 8 years, the federal government was really making freeway construction easier and less expensive, and this led to a big boom in freeway infrastructure. So like I mentioned, freeways really helped fuel the rise of the car culture. You could really tell that the rise in funding resulted in a change in American culture, in priorities. So in 1940, car ownership was under 50%. This was 4 years before any Freeway Act was even enacted. Car ownership's pretty low. You have a lot of people residing in the inner cities, and using public transit there. By 1960, only 4 years after the passing of the 1956 Act, about 80% of Americans were owning cars. So these statistics just really show how the infrastructure affected the culture. So because these freeways were becoming so cheap to construct, urban planners really began viewing them as solutions to urban decay. Urban decay at the time was what government officials, urban planners were seeing inner cities that were overcrowded, they had high crime rates, they were considered often in areas that were unsanitary living standards. And because of this, urban planners like Robert Moses, who was a famous urban planner in New York, saw the construction of highways as an opportunity to actually redeem these areas. So he was viewing these urban areas where he was witnessing the decay as cancerous, and he thought they were taking away from the prosperity, from the beauty of the country, and that they needed to be removed. Another figure, Thomas Mcdonald, our bottom right photo, he at the time was the commissioner of the Bureau of Public Roads, and he really took this a step further, and he tried to get highway construction classified as an urban renewal strategy in the 1949 Federal Housing Bill. So this really just goes to show, these high levels of government, how they were viewing and kind of the goals that they had for these spaces.
So what is their impact on our current housing situation? Well, first, they encourage and enable urban sprawl. More housing centered near jobs will be the way to combat both our housing shortage and meet our environmental goals. And freeways encourage and allow for the wrong kinds of development. They also eliminate potential space for homes. The Bay Area, by all estimates, is at least 700,000 homes short. And in such a dense area, we need all the land we can afford, and freeways simply take up valuable potential development space. And they also prioritize parking spaces over new home building. Hack likes to say that housing for people should be more important than housing for cars. But in a car-centric urban area, this is kind of unrealistic. Additionally, they reinforce and exacerbate racial segregation. They've been used as a tool to redline neighborhoods, and as Olivia said, a tool for redevelopment. All of this led to communities being further isolated from city goods and services. They help shift resources from cities to suburbs. Again, as Olivia said, freeways helped make white flight possible, and this exodus to the suburbs lessened urban tax bases across the country, which impacted a myriad of city services. And they also diverted funding from public transit to freeways. So a need for cars in urban areas basically translates to an underfunding of public transit and generous funding for building and maintaining freeways. This leaves modern cities with underdeveloped public transit. And I think everyone here is on the same page that increased housing and robust public transit go hand in hand. So having freeways divert dollars that could go towards public transportation is really detrimental to our goals. So this is a map by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, a federal entity from 1937. So this is before any freeways. And areas in red were deemed hazardous and risky for investment. And a large part of their rationale was based on a neighborhood's racial demographics. So you can see how San Francisco's current freeway system, they're concentrated in the southern and eastern neighborhoods, which were deemed less desirable by the government and were not coincidentally where many of San Francisco's communities of color are concentrated. And so this just demonstrates, again, how developers of the day saw freeways as more than just a convenient road for commuters, but also as a tool to divide and destroy communities and cities. So moving on to how it impacts human health, as expected, it's horrible for your health. Car emissions are predictably linked to long-term respiratory problems in children and adults. And the California Air Resources Board recommends living 500 feet away from any freeway. The LA City Council goes a step further in recommending living 1,000 feet away. Additionally, neighborhoods near freeways generally have less access to open space, so this further compounds the health impacts for residents. And not only is it unhealthy, it's not aesthetically pleasing. I mean, besides health effects, most people don't want the noise and the visual impacts of living near a freeway. So if we take a look here, many residential projects in the Bay Area today are proposed and built next to freeways. And this is a rendering of a potential development that would bring 235 homes to West Oakland and would also be right next to Interstate 880. And to be clear, this is an infill project in a neighborhood that's heavily impacted by displacement, and it would be a great and probably necessary addition to West Oakland. And it's unfortunately next to something of a health hazard. And as we'll discuss later, cities are starting to see situations like this and realize that, housing that a project like this would bring is going to be more beneficial and necessary than a freeway like 880, possibly. And just to quickly go over the impact on the environment, I think we all understand that the impact is immense from from the personal car, excuse me. And many of you are aware of AB 32, which came in 2006 and stated California's goal for all new vehicles to be electric by 2035. But this has to be coupled with a decrease in car use as well. Vehicle miles traveled has actually increased in California over the past decade, and the state will need to reverse this trend in order to meet AB 32's climate goals. So this will mean incentivizing alternative modes of transportation and de-incentivizing driving.
So kind of in response to the negative impacts that Adam laid out, you have impacts on residents, impacts on the environment. There was a large freeway backlash that really began as these constructions were popping up. So here's just two images that really highlight the grassroots organizing that was occurring. You were having residents, community members, various environmental advocacy groups, showing up, opposing pretty much the continued construction of these freeways. So like I mentioned, pretty much the Freeway Revolt, as was coined, pretty much started in 1956, led the way all the way through the 70s. And it was powered by just, your everyday community citizens who were opposing the impact that freeways were having on health. There was growing acknowledgement of housing issues like displacement. So pretty much you were seeing large groups, protesting at City Hall, signing large petitions, just trying to get these spaces taken down. In response, because the movements were so powerful, some cities did in fact modify or even cancel the proposed freeway routes. So in Boston, Governor Sargent actually canceled the construction of Route 128, with the exception of completing the central artery, which the construction on that had already begun. If he continued with the plan, it would have destroyed hundreds of homes, hundreds of businesses, and the Freeway Revolt, the opposition really came through. The whole construction was halted pretty much 80% of what they proposed, which would have changed the city of Boston as we know it today immensely. They were actually able to then allocate the money that would have finished the construction to boosting the city's public transit. So the Freeway Revolt really had some impacts on a lot of the cities that we know today, and really helped to bring forward to the public attention the impacts that these spaces were having. So what about freeways in San Francisco? So on the left, you can see an image from 1948 that shows the proposed planned San Francisco freeway system. In that image, the freeways look crazy. They definitely, thinking about the city today, alter all of our neighborhoods. It's just hard to imagine that happening at all. And on the right, this is kind of the proposed addition to the Embarcadero Freeway. It was pretty much going to cut through your Russian Hill, Telegraph Hill to connect to the Golden Gate Bridge. So super obtrusive, just would really alter the character of the city. So in San Francisco, there was a large freeway revolt that centered around protesting I-28, I-280, sorry. And you can see that on the right, that was kind of that really large expansion. And that was going to cost the city $40 million to construct. Again, it was going to destroy businesses, destroy homes. The neighborhoods there that we know today would not exist. And so they were able to gather about 30,000 signatures on the petition. And it actually was announced that 75% of that planned construction would be canceled. So despite that, San Francisco did have a large battle with one of their freeways, the Embarcadero Freeway. So in these two images, you can see the before and after of just how obtrusive that freeway really was. So you're having that double-decker freeway spanning pretty much, a few miles down on what is now very essential landmark Embarcadero space. So in the right photo, you can just really see the landmark, the ferry building was really altered. And so in response, there was a large freeway revolt, and they had a huge petition going around, which unfortunately was vetoed on the ballot. And at the time, Mayor Feinstein pretty much called that an anti-environmental vote. So we were seeing an increase from that original grassroots organizing to local leaders speaking out on behalf of these projects. And so in 1989, there was the Loma Prieta earthquake, and that was the final demise of the freeway, where they determined that repair costs would be far more expensive than demolishing the space. And since we've really had a birth of that waterfront space, there are multiple miles of public space there. You have Herman Cain Plaza. So a lot of reinventing there that has really boosted the city's economic growth, as well as expanded our public space system. So here's just a few examples of other large cities who have had similar transformations. You have Boston on the left, that's the transformation to that central artery. So like I mentioned before, there was a large revolt in Boston, Freeway Revolt, and the only part that the revolt was unable to cancel was the central artery, because they had already started construction on it. So that project has really come full circle. It was tore down. You can see kind of in the bottom photo, the space really invented at a lower scale vehicle corridor. You have more open space. It just, really expanded the view sheds in the area. In the middle, you have Portland. They converted their Harbor Drive freeway to a huge pedestrian-oriented public space right on the waterfront. So just great open space for the city. And then on the right, the city of New Haven is actually currently undergoing transformative efforts. So they have 3 proposed projects to convert the freeway. And the one that's kind of, leading the effort right now is a large economic and housing development to take that place. So these 3 examples just really highlight the various opportunities that cities have when they reuse these spaces, either for economic growth, ways to address the housing shortage, or to just increase public open space. So kind of like with the growing acknowledgement of these, horrible negative impacts that Adam and I have laid out, cities have really started to look to these spaces in a reflective way and acknowledge the impacts that they have had. Kind of full circle, coming from that grassroots freeway revolt, now Congress is considering a $10 billion bill that would actually fund cities to remove these spaces and convert them to pedestrian-oriented boulevards. So a lot of momentum in the news right now, some great things happening. So where's the future of freeways headed? Like I mentioned, there's a growing agreement about freeways' detrimental effects. We're seeing that all around us. There's new policies to protect residents. So in 2003, there was the passing of SB 52, which actually prohibited the placement of schools within 500 feet of freeways. So we're hoping something like that will translate over to housing. There's also been legal actions to block new construction. And as I mentioned in my examples, a lot of increased movement to tear them down and revitalize the urban spaces. So with that being said, I would love to pass it over to Liz, who is a project lead on Gould Evan Central Freeway redesign.
Thanks, Olivia and Adam, for highlighting the history of freeways, inequitable history, and kind of how it connects to housing policy. And I just wanted to say that the research that you did, really helped us at Gould Evans as we've been working with a, kind of loose multidisciplinary team to try to dig into this issue and look at it as well. And how we've been looking at whether we can basically reimagine the Central Freeway infrastructure to better serve our communities. This is an aerial view of the Central Freeway's northern extension that runs right past our offices. We share an office with the HAC, a physical office. And you could actually go to the next slide, which shows a map of the same, sort of spur northern extension of the Central Freeway that remained after Octavia Boulevard was created in the mid-90s. So it's a bit of a holdover, from that time. And as we understand it, there was even talk of removing the freeway all the way back to US 101 at that time, but it was considered to be just too much politically. So we're community members adjacent to the freeway. We deal with all of the impacts that you mentioned, probably health impacts. Certainly it creates a neighborhood divider and sort of cuts the, SOMA and Mission and the hub off from each other. So, we've been thinking about this since we're so close to it and asking, what might it look like to reclaim this space for our surrounding communities? And you could go on to the next slide. So we're very early in a process of just, kind of doing a little bit of ideation to provoke questions and dialogue, but our goal is really to start talking with the surrounding communities about, how they perceive the freeway and what they want, what would kind of, what they'd like to elevate within their communities, and maybe how we could think about this infrastructure a bit differently and reclaim the space. And you could go on to the next slide. We looked at a couple of ideas, just, what if obviously the obvious idea would be to remove it and kind of knit the neighborhoods together. But what if it remained and some of the structure was reused and it could be, kind of converted into an elevated park or some type of open space that could, be a more sustainable move, perhaps. The steel structure is actually very beautiful, and, it's an interesting idea that we've been looking at. And you could go on to the next slide. We've been thinking preliminarily about, whether the new open space then could support, different types of recreation that the community around might value, food, arts and culture. Of course, the notion of housing adjacent to the freeway is also brought up by any kind of conversion. And you could go on to the next slide. We've even been starting to dig into, with a landscape architect partner, this notion of whether it could actually be a power generator with solar, panels, and whether it could support community resiliency in other ways. We recently learned that the watershed, the Mission Creek used to run partially below Division Street, which is this, the street below the freeway, and the creek bed, and where it sort of terminates is an area that floods often, within the city. And I mean, that's why, because it's essentially where a creek terminates. So, that is something that we're starting to look at in terms of whether that creek could be daylit and what benefits that might have. So you could keep going, and even this notion of, if it becomes a green space, could the green space start to extend outwards, north-south, to begin to knit the surrounding neighborhoods together and become sort of like a set of urban lungs that regenerates the city from this point. And go on to the next slide. So, as I mentioned, we're we're coming up with preliminary ideas, and we understand that there would be a long road ahead, to doing something like this. It would be a major infrastructure project, but the idea has a lot of potential. And as Olivia mentioned, there's actually some federal funding that could potentially be used for something like this. The Economic Justice Act, it's called Highways to Boulevards Initiative, is kind of making its way through the Senate right now. And that could be a source of funding. We intend to start a community engagement process and see what ideas that brings up. We also realize that a traffic study would be critical to understanding how this could work, since we'd be removing traffic capacity. But if it could be part of a larger vision that the city has for transitioning away from automobile culture, we think it has a lot of potential. And so that resiliency angle is something that we're digging into pretty deeply as well. And that's where we are.
Thank you, Liz. And we'd like to open it up to you all if you have any questions or comments. Can utilize the raise the hand function. Be great. Julie Christensen.
Sure. So if everybody's going to be quiet on a warm afternoon, I'll launch something off. So this is great because it gives me an opportunity to flap around my favorite issue. A couple of things. As far as HAC's concerned, I just wonder if anybody's done a count of how many units of housing have been built within 500 feet of 101 or 280 in the last 5 years. Because I work with the Green Benefit District in Dogpatch, and I can tell you that my guess is over 2,000 units of housing have been added. And you add Mission Bay to that, and then you add office buildings to that. I believe that there are more than 2,000 units of housing in Dogpatch that have been constructed in the last 3 to 5 years that are within 500 feet, certainly within a block of 280. And so what's happening is that developers and the city are losing their squeamishness about building adjacent to freeways. And so we just have lots more people living there than used to. I don't know to what extent, these buildings are capable of filtration and noise cancellation and whatnot. But, it's like people moving into the forests and then fires happening, right? It's like we're building next to these freeways. So suddenly a lot more people are becoming aware of them. So a lot of my constituents in Potrero Hill and Dogpatch are concerned about traffic issues now more than they used to be, certainly the pollution and the noise. But my pet focus is the damage that these freeways do in terms of the land use that surrounds them. And I think removal is great. We're focused more on mitigation. So if you look at what happens underneath 101 and 280, the kinds of uses that Caltrans permits and encourages are in many cases some of the lowest quality uses of any available land in the city of San Francisco. And then that misery spreads out. So they're encouraging encampments, debris, dumping, graffiti, vermin, weeds, right? So these freeways are, problems in and of themselves, but what happens under and around them is a scourge. And the other data I'd love is how much maintenance around the freeways in particular is costing the city of San Francisco every year. Caltrans has reduced by a huge proportion the amount of money that they spend on freeway maintenance within the city limits of San Francisco. So you can drive down these freeways and see trash like you never saw 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. Like, okay, my dog's gonna eat the mailman. So other cities, Miami, Dallas, for Pete's sake, Seattle, St. Louis, Toronto, other cities have managed to reclaim this land, take it away from the freeway agencies and reclaim it and repurpose it. So Toronto has 2 miles of ice skating lanes underneath an elevated freeway. Miami's got data on how much they were able to increase tax income by raising the values of the properties adjacent to freeways. That cost of dealing with homeless encampments and graffiti and whatnot. And so to me, that's, you know, people go, oh yeah, pollution, but that disaster that surrounds the freeways is, to me, one of the biggest problems in our city, and I can't find anybody interested in addressing it. And so that that convergence of housing and business space with the freeways, I think, is going to bring this more to the fore. And the other thing, you know, I've sort of pushed against a lot of immovable questions in my career. And the one thing I think any group would have to do in order to make this even a discussion is to figure out how to deal with the traffic. Because for San Francisco, the fact is that we're the nexus between North, South, and East Bay, and that people have to go through us to get to those places is what led to the construction of the freeways in the first place. And so having a solution for that reduction or realignment of traffic, I think, is going to have to be the lead point in any effort to get people to take seriously the further demolition of some of these roadways.
Thank you for your comments and question, Julie. I will say this research project was prompted by our relationship with Gould Evan, so we're not really in the business of getting into a lot of research, but definitely took note of some of your questions. And if there's capacity later on, maybe someone from staff can connect with you. I'm about to drop into the chat. We actually have a conversation about the intersection between building homes and the impact on the environment coming up on April 22nd, and highly encourage people to join us for that as well. John, I saw that you had your hand raised.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, great. Yeah, I have a few comments. I am definitely in favor of lowering the freeway, having it touch down earlier than Octavia. Another place that I think there's like a 50-year cycle on some of these structures. And one of the structures that's way over 50 years old is the 280 overpass through Glen Park. And that might be another area to look at. San Jose Avenue might as well be a freeway, and it could have a lot of housing along the side. There was some drawings that were made a few years ago that were intriguing by some neighborhood activists. Also, I want to echo what Julie said about transit. You know, if we're going to get rid of the freeways, which is I'm all for, we are all going to have to, at the same time, start thinking about really upping our game in transit. And that means subways and light rail, and not streetcars, light rail that has its own right of way, and actual improvements that can actually replace the freeways. Because the Octavia Boulevard, it's a beautiful boulevard, and we knew it was going to be crowded, you know, when we took down the freeway, because we took it down at Market Street. And it does a great job of filtering the traffic. Robin Levitt's here; he can talk about it. You know, we really needed to, at the same time, think of ways to transit people through, not in cars. And one other observation about the historical presentation. A lot of the San Francisco, I don't know about Boston or Seattle, but the San Francisco Freeway Revolt was, you know, we don't really have any bad neighborhoods in San Francisco. So a lot of these freeways that were planned were going through people's backyards. And it was your traditional NIMBY impulses that opposed the freeways. And a lot of politicians names that we know, Sue Bierman, Willie Brown, Calvin Welch, were all original people in the Freeway Revolt. And also a lot of people that in those days it was okay to say they were called housewives. You know, they were wives of who didn't work, of rich men in the neighborhood. What you don't see is a successful freeway revolt in Oakland, where you didn't have that kind of middle class activism. And if we're going to start thinking about taking down freeways, I'd like to see it be a little more inclusive, and I'd like to understand how we can extend it into places like Oakland, because there was no freeway revolt there, and it was not that city is bisected by overpasses everywhere you look, and it's just an example of what happens when you don't rebel against freeways. So I'll shut up. But those are my 2 cents.
No, thank you for bringing up. It's something worth talking about, that the Calvin Welches of the world were, had a huge part in the San Francisco Freeway Revolts. So it is an interesting, comparison between then. We definitely see what they did as a positive. Like, I don't think
Yes,
anyone,
of course.
yeah, I don't think anyone can imagine, a panhandle freeway right through the park. And we also have to acknowledge that 50 years later, times change, needs of the city changes, and Hack would say that Hank has not changed along with those times. So yeah, thank you.
They're fighting the last battle.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Robin Levitt, you have your hand up. Hello.
Robin, if you'd like to speak, I believe you're muted.
Yeah. I still can't hear anything.
Corey?
Yeah, going back, I think, a little bit to Julie and John's point, and thinking specifically about this section as it stretches to Octavia. When this conversation first came up, this is both a route that Kayla and I use. Like, we use that section of the freeway to get home if we're coming from the East Bay or something like that, because it is such a divergence. And so I think one time we had discussed, like, okay, if that section no longer exists, how do we get home? Like, what route do we take, right? If we're coming from the south, then you're probably taking 9th Street, and what does that do? Because there's no natural like advocacy group for tearing down freeways, right? It's kind of this, like, everybody says, oh, it's a good idea, but nobody's made it their professional mission. That the organizing around it has really been tough. And I think in theory, many people can get behind this idea of some roads are perfect for cars, some roads are perfect for public transportation, some roads are perfect for pedestrians and bikes, but we don't plan our cities that way. Everybody gets, 80% of, cars get 80% of every road for private vehicles, and 15% of some roads are for bike lanes, but not all. And so I think the overall just kind of reimagining of how these spaces work and how public transportation infrastructure can work in a city can alleviate those problems, because I do believe people would be supportive of these efforts if they felt like proper consideration and proper financial investments were going to solving the problems. Like, well, yeah, but what are you going to do with all the people that are using that right now? And so most people, I always feel like, just want to be heard. They're not dead set against an issue. And if you can show, hey, here's how we're going to solve your concerns, they can be persuaded to be supportive. Got to sell the vision the right way. Robin, if you're on your phone, I believe it's *6 is how you unmute yourself on a phone, or maybe *9, one or the other.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. Yeah, I didn't realize that. Yeah, my computer doesn't have audio on it, so I can't speak to you guys on that computer. But anyhow, great presentation. Really interesting ideas here. As John mentioned, there is also the Central Freeway is part of the Freeway Revolt that didn't get mentioned. So you might want to include that besides the Embarcadero. So that was a big battle, if anybody remembers it. But anyhow, I just wanted to mention that Jeffrey Tumlin, who heads SFMTA, many years ago when he worked at a transportation planning firm, came up with plans for taking down the rest of the Central Freeway. So Liz, you might want to be in touch with him about those plans. It's very interesting.
Thank you. We have actually, yeah. And I
Oh, okay.
appreciate that. He's a big proponent of the idea and one of the earliest people we've spoken with on this. And
Perfect.
thank
Okay,
you.
Great. And then there's also, then you probably are aware, there's also the hub planning process that's ongoing, that this would be a key component of it as well. So that's something you want to tie into. And then just, I'm a resident of Hayes Valley, and I know that myself, speaking out for myself and my neighbors, we would be very enthusiastic about this effort. The Central Freeway, though we don't have the elevated structure anymore in our neighborhood, it brings all kinds of problems to our neighborhood, not only traffic, but crime, and home. Also, we do have the homeless encampments along Octavia Boulevard. So it would be something that Hayes Valley would enthusiastically embrace. I'm happy to connect with you and help with this effort. I think it's a great idea.
Thank you so much. We'll definitely connect.
Thanks.
And Bob Baum.
Sure. So I'm Bob Baum, also with Gould Evans, working with Liz on this. And, our desire here is to provoke this conversation, particularly with regard to the Central Freeway. And we have had conversations with a number of people around town. We've talked to planning, and again, just a sort of a sample of people around town who would be interested in this and might take an interest. And we're finding a lot of interest. Some of our next steps are to try to engage specifically with some of the groups most affected by the Central Freeway. But I wanted to say to all of you, and Robin appreciated what you said, that we would, anybody who's interested in this, we'd love to talk to. Julie, for example, if we could find a moment, would love to get more of your thoughts. So we're sort of engaged in a hopefully not quixotic effort here, but think this is a conversation we should all be having. And I think it's, there was a moment last year where I thought, well, how could we be talking about this in all the other crises we're dealing with? But I think it's as good a time as any to try to, think in a visionary way about what comes next in the city. So, we're excited about doing this, and just trying to get a group of fellow travelers, if you will, to work with us and make this happen. So I just want to mostly say, thanks to the Hack for doing this, Olivia and Adam, great research, and whoever's interested coming out of this, please let us know. And if you've got other ideas and other connections you think we ought to make, we want to hear about that. So thanks.
Thank you. And if no one else has any questions or comments, we can just quickly go to the references. As Olivia said, there's a ton of momentum on this subject. These are just, 4 sources that we thought would, be really interesting if you are interested in researching and reading about it more. And we will send out an email to all of the attendees tomorrow, so you don't have to take a screenshot now. But yeah, there's some really interesting literature out there and really good visuals about the physical impacts that these freeways have done. And right, as Gould Evan said, you can reach out to them, and thank you for connecting with us. And thank you for spending your late afternoon with us.
Yes, thank you everyone for coming.
Thanks so much for the invitation to all the HAC members, especially to Olivia and Adam for the great research.
Great. We will let you go.
Okay.